The fence was already 6 posts deep into the ground before Caroline Keene even realized someone was building it. She had been so consumed with the business of surviving hauling water from the creek before dawn, patching the roof of the barn with boards that were never quite the right size, arguing with herself about whether the south pasture could support another season of grazing without ruining what little good grass remained, that she had not noticed the sound of hammering drifting up from the property line. Not at first. Not until the third morning, when she stepped outside with her coffee still steaming in the blue tin cup her mother had given her, and looked out past the broken gate toward the long stretch of open land that separated her small homestead from the road, and saw him. He was tall, lean in the way that hard work makes a man lean rather than hunger, and he was driving a post into the earth with a methodical, unhurried rhythm that suggested he had been doing this sort of thing for a very long time. He wore a dun-colored hat pushed back on his head, a plain cotton shirt and suspenders over it. His boots were scuffed but solid. He did not look up when she came out. He did not seem to notice her at all, though she was quite sure he had noticed everything. It was the spring of 1878, and Caroline had been alone on the Keene homestead outside the small town of Harlan's Crossing, Kansas, for 8 months. 8 months since her father had taken sick so fast, it seemed almost like a trick, gone in 3 weeks from a man who could lift a steer by one horn to a man who could not lift his own hand. 8 months since she had buried him on the hill behind the barn, under the 2 cottonwood trees he had always said he liked because they sounded like rain when the wind came through them. 8 months of doing everything herself, of learning what she did not know, which was considerable, and of refusing to ask for help, which was a stubbornness she had inherited directly from her father along with the land and the debt. She was 24 years old, and she had grown up in this territory, and she was not afraid of the man building the fence, exactly. But she was confused by him, and confusion was something she had even less patience for than weakness. She walked down to the property line with her coffee. The morning was cool and clean, the sky above the flat Kansas plain already turning from pale gray to a deep and promising blue. Meadowlarks were calling from somewhere in the tall grass. She stopped about 10 feet from where he was working and watched him set the post, check it with a level that he pulled from his back pocket, and adjusted a 1/4 inch before packing the dirt around its base with the flat end of his post hole digger. He straightened and looked at her then. His eyes were the color of the creek in late summer, that particular shade of gray-green that shifts depending on what the sky is doing. He had a few days of stubble on his jaw, and there was a long, thin scar at his left temple that looked old, white and settled in the skin. He was, she guessed, somewhere around 28 or 30. He had the face of a man who had thought a great deal and spoken very little. "Morning," he said. "That is my fence line," Caroline said. "Yes, ma'am." "You are building a fence on my fence line." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the posts he had already sunk, 6 of them spaced with what looked like careful precision, running south from the road. She looked at the coil of wire beside his tools, the extra posts stacked in the bed of a wagon pulled off to the side of the road with a bay horse hitched to it. There was enough material there for a considerable stretch of fence. "I did not ask anyone to build a fence," she said. He nodded slowly, as though she had said something he found reasonable. "No, ma'am, you did not." She waited for more. He offered nothing more. He reached for another post from the stack at his feet, carried it to where he had already marked the ground and began driving it. She went back to the house and told herself it was not her concern, and spent the next 2 hours trying to believe that. His name was Daniel Sawyer, and she learned it the way she learned most things in Harlan's Crossing, which was by going into Murdoch's general store and asking Eliza Murdoch, who knew the name and business of every soul within 40 miles. Eliza was a small, round woman with bright, dark eyes and a tendency to speak as though each piece of information she shared was a gift she had been saving specially for you. "Daniel Sawyer," Eliza said, leaning over the counter with the expression of someone presenting a fine piece of china. "He came through about 2 months back, before you had the trouble with the Aldridge boys taking those cattle of yours. He works fence and repair work mostly, takes jobs around the county, stays at the rooming house off the main street. Quiet man, paid his bill every Friday without being reminded, which is more than I can say for half the county. Did someone hire him to work on my property? Caroline asked. Eliza's expression shifted to something more carefully neutral. Not that I have heard. Does he do this often? Build things for people who have not hired him? I could not say, Eliza said, and her tone suggested she was choosing not to say, which was a different thing entirely. Caroline bought her flour and her salt and her tin of baking powder, and she drove the wagon back to the homestead. And all the way there, she was turning the thing over in her mind like a stone. She could not find a good flat surface to set down on. She did not go back down to the fence line that day, or the next. But she could hear him working from the kitchen window on still mornings, the steady percussion of the post driver carrying across the open ground. And sometimes in the late afternoon, when she came in from checking on the cattle, she would see the fence line had grown another 20 feet south, precise and clean. The wire stretched taut between the posts with a tension that spoke of someone who understood exactly how tight wire needed to be before it was useful. On the 5th day, she brought him water. She told herself it was a practical decision. A man working in the spring heat, however mild, needed water, and she was not a hard woman, and there was nothing charitable about letting someone expire of thirst on her property line. She walked down with a jar of cold water she had pulled from the stone crock in the cellar, and she stood at what she had begun to think of as her side of the invisible boundary between them, and held it out. He looked at the jar, then at her, then set down his tools and came to take it. His hand was broad and the knuckles were scarred in the way that knuckles scar from years of rough work, and when he took the jar their fingers did not touch, but the possibility of touching was present in the air between them, and Caroline registered this fact with the same part of her mind that registered the weather. "Thank you," he said, and drank most of it without stopping. "You are welcome," she said. She waited again. He waited too, she thought, as if there was a conversation they were both standing on the edge of without quite stepping into it. "Are you going to tell me why you are doing this?" she asked. He looked at the fence line for a moment, then back at her. "Which part of it is most confusing to you?" he asked. It was such an unexpected question that she almost laughed. "All of it," she said honestly. He handed back the jar. "I noticed the line was down," he said. "The posts had rotted through in 6 places. With the spring thaw, any cattle that drifted would have gone straight through onto the road or onto what is left of the neighboring claim. It seemed like the sort of thing that should be corrected. Most men who notice something like that on someone else's property keep on riding," she said. "I expect that is true," he said, and went back to his work. She stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then walked back to the house, and she thought about what he had said, and what he had not said, which she suspected was the larger part of the story. The days became a rhythm she had not chosen but found herself arranging her work around. She would bring water in the morning and sometimes in the afternoon. He would accept it without a great deal of ceremony. They would exchange a few words about the progress of the fence, about the weather, about small observable things. He had a way of listening that she was not accustomed to, a quality of attention that felt like being looked at directly rather than sideways, which was how most men in Harlan's Crossing had looked at her since her father died, with that particular mixture of pity and appraisal that made her want to bar the door. She learned that he had come from Missouri originally, that he had done various kinds of work across Kansas and Colorado and briefly into the New Mexico territory, that he kept a journal though he did not say what he wrote in it. She learned that he had an opinion about the proper tension of barbed wire versus smooth wire for different kinds of livestock, and that this opinion was based on actual observation rather than habit, which she respected. She learned that he could sit entirely still for minutes at a time when he was thinking, in a way that most people could not manage. She did not learn why he was building the fence. On the 11th day, one of her cows, a broad, slow-thinking animal she had named Josephine more out of exasperation than affection, put her head through the section of the old fence line that had not yet been replaced and got herself thoroughly tangled in the remaining rusted wire. Caroline found her in the early afternoon, and the situation was not immediately dangerous, but it was not good, and pulling wire off a 1,200-pound cow that had decided the appropriate response to being trapped was to pull harder in the direction that was making things worse required more than two hands. She went to find Daniel Sawyer without deciding to find Daniel Sawyer. She simply walked to where he was working and said, "I have a cow in trouble," and he set down his tools and followed her back without asking for any further explanation, which she appreciated. They worked together for 40 minutes getting Josephine untangled, which involved a good deal of careful wire bending and talking to the cow in voices that were respectively firm and gentle. Josephine seemed to respond better to the gentle approach, which Daniel provided with a calm steadiness that surprised Caroline. He had clearly handled livestock before and in some quantity. His hands moved with sureness along the wire, feeling for the tension, releasing it in small increments rather than pulling, and when the last strand came free and Josephine lurched forward and nearly knocked them both down, Caroline grabbed the post of the barn to keep herself standing and found that Daniel was right beside her, one hand briefly at her elbow to steady her, warm and sure. He released her the moment she had her footing, as if he was entirely conscious of the line between what was helpful and what was presumptuous. "Thank you," she said, slightly breathless from the exertion, and from something else she chose not to examine too closely. "She should be fine," he said, watching Josephine walk away with an offended dignity that was genuinely funny. "Might want to keep her away from the unfinished section." "That has been my ongoing project since I bought her," Caroline said. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it, the slight softening at the corner of his mouth, and she thought it was probably a very good smile when it arrived completely. They walked back to the fence line together, which felt natural in a way that walking anywhere with anyone had not felt natural to Caroline in 8 months. "You know cattle," she said. "I did some ranching," he said. "Before." Before what, she thought, and did not ask, because she had enough of her own befores that she did not want to answer questions about. That evening she sat on the porch as the sun went down, painting the flat land in shades of orange and deep purple, and she thought about Daniel Sawyer in a way that she had not thought about anyone in a very long time, with a curiosity that was warm rather than suspicious. She thought about his hands and the way he talked to a panicking cow, and the fact that he had been out here for 11 days building her something she had not asked for. She was starting to have a theory about the why of the fence. She was not entirely ready to look at the theory directly. 2 weeks into the fence project, the Aldridge situation came to a head. Cole Aldridge was the son of the man who had owned the large ranch to the north of the Keene homestead, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously inconvenienced by the consequences of his own behavior. His father had been a difficult neighbor, but a basically lawful one. Cole was something else. Since his father had handed over the management of the ranch operations 18 months ago, there had been 3 different disputes with neighboring homesteaders about missing cattle, all of which had been resolved in ways that favored the Aldridge operation, and left the other parties feeling that resolution was a word that could mean many different things. Caroline had lost 7 head of cattle in the fall to what she was nearly certain was deliberate fence cutting on the shared boundary, but she had no proof that would satisfy Marshal Wick, who was a man of considerable limitations as a peace officer, and she had contented herself with repairing the fence and keeping a closer eye on the herd. Cole Aldridge came to her property on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of April, riding a spotted horse and bringing 2 of his men with him. Caroline saw them coming from the window and took a moment to settle herself before she went out to meet them on the porch. Cole was good-looking in a careless way, with the kind of easy smile that worked on people who had not seen it applied without sincerity. He was 27 years old and had grown up knowing the land around him was his or would be his, which had given him a relationship to boundaries that was entirely theoretical. "Miss Keene," he said, touching the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "Mr. Aldridge," she said. "Heard you had someone doing fence work out here." He glanced toward the south boundary without looking like he was glancing, which required more subtlety than he possessed. "I do," she said. "Thing is," Cole said, in the particular tone of a man who has decided that what is good for him is also what is reasonable, "the old parson claim that borders your south pasture, that claim was let go 3 years back without being properly filed. My father purchased the rights to it last year, which means the survey line for that fence might be running a few feet into Aldridge land." Caroline looked at him. "The survey line for that fence is the same survey line that has existed since my father filed on this claim in 1867, she said. "If there is a dispute about the parson land, I would need to see the deed." Cole's smile did not waver, but something behind it hardened slightly. "I am just raising the question." "You have raised it," she said. "I will look into it." He held her gaze for a moment in a way that was meant to feel like pressure. "I hope we can be neighborly about this," he said. "I am always neighborly," Caroline said, "with neighbors who behave in a neighborly fashion." After they had ridden away, she stood on the porch for a long moment and felt the particular cold weight of threat settling over her, the way it had settled over her when the cattle went missing, and the sheriff looked at her with sympathetic uselessness. She was alone on this land, and she was capable and she was stubborn, but she was also honest enough to admit that being alone made you smaller against some problems. She walked down to the fence line. Daniel was there, working quietly on the last stretch of the southern boundary. He looked up when she came and seemed to read something in her face, though she had arranged it as carefully as she could. "Aldridge came by," she said. "He set down the wire strainer. I saw him ride out. He is claiming a survey dispute on the south pasture line." She sat down on one of the extra posts, not because she needed to sit, but because standing felt precarious. "He wants to say the fence is going in on his property." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Has the survey been filed at the county seat? My father filed everything properly when he claimed this land. I have the papers." "Then the survey stands until he can produce a counterfiling," Daniel said. "He cannot simply say a line is wrong. He has to prove it is wrong, and proving it means going through the county land office, and that takes time and costs money." She looked at him. "You know about land law." "I know a little about a lot of things," he said. "Do you know why Cole Aldridge has been running the smaller homesteaders off their claims for the last year and a half?" Daniel picked up the wire strainer again and turned it in his hands. "I expect it has something to do with the railroad survey that came through this county last fall," he said quietly. "The route they are planning goes right through the middle of this valley. Anyone who holds a claim on that route when the railroad makes its purchase offer stands to collect considerably. The Aldridge operation does not currently have enough land in the right corridor. But if they could pick up 2 or 3 of the smaller claims," Caroline stared at him. "How do you know about the railroad survey?" He met her eyes. "I have been in this county for 2 months," he said simply. She thought about that. She thought about a man arriving in a county 2 months ago, learning the landscape of it in ways that went beyond fence posts and wire tension, and then beginning to build something on the property of a woman who had been left alone to deal with exactly the kind of situation he had just described. The theory she had been not quite looking at came into clearer focus. "Daniel," she said. "Yes. Why are you building this fence?" He was still for a moment. The meadowlarks were calling again, the late afternoon light making long gold shadows across the flat ground. He looked at the fence line and then at the land beyond it and then at her, and she watched him reach for an answer the way a man reaches for something in a dark room, not certain exactly where it is. "I cannot give you a simple answer to that," he said at last. It was so direct in its indirection that it stopped her. She had expected deflection or a practical explanation. The rotted posts, the drifting cattle, the survey line. Instead, he had simply said that the answer existed and was complicated and he could not compress it into a simple thing. "Then give me the complicated one," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Not yet," he said. It was not a refusal. It was, she thought, a timing. "Let me finish what I am doing first." She nodded, though she was not sure why she accepted that, except that she trusted it, which was itself a thing worth noticing. She went back to the house and pulled her father's land records out of the cedar chest where she kept everything important, and spread them on the kitchen table in the yellow lamplight, and studied the survey documents until she understood them as well as she was going to understand them. And then she made a list of what she needed to do at the county seat in Ellsworth to make sure her position was as clear and documented as possible. She was not going to lose this land. She had not understood before her father died how deep the land had gotten into her. She had grown up here and taken it for granted the way you take for granted the things that have always been there: the cottonwoods, the creek sound, the particular smell of the soil after rain. After her father died and she was left alone with it, she had discovered that the land was not a backdrop. It was something she was made of, woven through her in ways that surprised her each time they revealed themselves. She would walk the south pasture at dusk and feel it, not sentimentally, not poetically, but in her bones, a certainty that this specific ground was worth every hard morning and every sleepless night and every moment of grinding uncertainty. She was not going to let Cole Aldrich take it. She drove to Ellsworth 4 days later with her papers wrapped in oilskin in the leather satchel her father had used for business. The county seat was a full day's drive, and she stayed at a clean rooming house on the main street and spent 2 days at the land office, making sure that every document relating to the Keene claim was in order, properly filed and indexed, with a letter from the county recorder confirming the boundary survey on file. She also, while she was there, paid a visit to the office of a man named Albert Schofield, who was a land attorney with a reputation for knowing the relevant statutes, and who confirmed what Daniel had told her about Cole Aldrich's options for disputing the survey. "He can file a counterclaim, Mr. Schofield said, but it will require a new survey at his expense, and as long as your original filing is clean, which it appears to be, he is fighting uphill. Your position is solid, Miss Keene, as long as your boundary fence is in good repair." She thought about the fence being built at this very moment, post by post, by a man who apparently knew all of this already. On the drive back from Ellsworth, she let herself think about Daniel Sawyer without the guarded quality she usually applied to thinking about him. She thought about the scar at his temple, and the journal she had never read, and the way he talked to frightened animals. She thought about the fact that he had been in this county for 2 months before he started building the fence, which meant he had spent time learning the lay of the land, the Aldrich situation, the railroad survey, the Keene claim, before he ever picked up a post-hole digger. She thought about what it meant that a man would do all of that. She arrived home in the late afternoon to find the fence nearly complete. He was on the last section, the northeast corner that came around to join the old fence near the barn, and the work was clean and careful all the way along, the posts straight and evenly spaced, the wire tight and properly stapled. It looked like fence that would stand for 20 years. She unhitched the horse and put her away and walked down to where Daniel was working. He looked up and she thought she saw something in his face that was relief, not the kind of relief that comes from being let off the hook, but the kind that comes from watching something you were worried about return safely. "How was Ellsworth?" he asked. She stopped. "How did you know I went to Ellsworth?" "I did not know for certain," he said. "But I thought you might, once I told you about the survey situation." She looked at him for a long moment. The evening was quiet around them, the sky turning the colors of embers. "My documents are in order," she said. "The boundary is clear and the filing is solid. Aldrich will have a difficult time making any kind of case." He nodded, and the relief was more visible now. "Good," he said. "Daniel, yes. You have been in this county since February," she said. You started building this fence in April. That is 2 months of arriving before you picked up a post hole digger. What were you doing for 2 months? He set down his tools and looked at her directly. There was something in his expression that she could not immediately categorize. It was not guilt exactly, and it was not pride. It was something quieter and more private than either of those things. Learning, he said. Learning what? The shape of things, he said. Who was who? What was happening with the land claims? Whether the situation was what I thought it was? What situation did you think it was? He was quiet for a moment. My father grew up about 30 miles from here, he said. He homesteaded a claim in this valley in 1864, lost it in 1866 to a combination of drought and a land dispute with a larger operation that had better lawyers. He talked about it until the day he died. About this valley, about what he could have built here if things had been different. He picked up a staple from the pile beside him and turned it between his fingers. I was passing through last winter and I saw how the land lay. I asked around about who was holding the claims in this part of the valley. I heard about a woman alone on a good homestead, dealing with pressure from a larger operation and a fence line that had been going to ruin since her father died. She was very still. And I thought, he said, and stopped and started again more carefully. I thought that there were things I could do that might be useful, practical things. A fence is a practical thing. It is, she said. Her voice was steady, but something under it was not entirely steady. I am not, he stopped again, looked at the fence post in front of him. I did not come here with any kind of expectation, he said. I want to be clear about that. I did not come here because of any intention toward you that you had not agreed to. I came here because the situation seemed to call for something being done and I could do it. He looked at her. That is the honest version. The simple version is that I cannot give you. She understood then. She understood it in the way that you understand something you have known for a while, but have been arranging carefully around rather than looking at directly. The simple version would have been that he had come here because of her, or because of something that was not yet fully formed and therefore could not be stated simply. The honest version was everything he had just said, which was not simple at all but was clear in its own way. She sat down on the post stack as she had before in the last of the evening light and looked at the fence he had built. It was a very good fence. My father would have said you used the right spacing between posts, she said. She heard him exhale, something relaxing in him that had been held tight. 33 inches, for the wire gauge and the land. He would have asked you where you learned that. My grandfather taught me before he died, and you would have told him that. Yes, she looked at him, he looked back at her. The meadowlarks were quiet now, and the sky was deep blue in the east where night was coming, and the evening star was out over the flat land. And she thought about how she had been alone for 8 months, and how that had felt like the rest of her life stretching out in the same direction. And she had accepted it because she was stubborn and capable, and because she did not know how to ask for what she needed. I am going to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is complicated. All right, he said. Did you build this fence for me? The pause was long, and she let it be long because she could see him working toward the honest answer with the same methodical care he had brought to every post. I built it for you, he said, and for the reasons I told you, and because I did not know how else to begin a conversation, I had no right to begin another way. He looked at his hands. I know that is probably not what you were expecting to hear. No, she said, it is not. I apologize if it was presumptuous. It was enormously presumptuous, she said. Then, after a beat, it was also the kindest thing anyone has done for me since my father died. He looked up. Do not take that as more than what it is, she said quickly, though without harshness. I am not a woman who is easily swept along by a gesture, even a substantial one, but I am also not a woman who refuses to see things clearly when they are clear. She stood. You have been honest with me. I will be honest with you. I think you are a good man, and I think you have been careful in the way you have gone about this, and I am willing to see where a properly conducted conversation leads. That is all I am saying right now. He nodded, and this time the smile came all the way, and she had been right. It was a very good smile. "That is enough," he said. "More than enough." She walked back to the house, and she did not look back, but she was smiling in the dark, and the evening air felt different against her face than it had that morning. The spring deepened around them in the way that Kansas springs deepen, slowly and then all at once, the grass going green overnight, the cottonwood leaves coming in small and bright and trembling, the creek running high and cold from the snowmelt further north. Caroline and Daniel fell into the rhythm of conversation, the way they had fallen into everything else, carefully at first and then with increasing ease, finding that they were both people who had thought a great deal and found few other people worth thinking alongside. He came to the house for supper on a Sunday in late April, and she cooked a proper meal, venison with the dried herbs she had kept from the fall and cornbread and the last of the apple preserves, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for 4 hours about things she had not talked to anyone about since her father died, about the land and what she intended to do with it, about the railroad and what it might mean for the county, about the question of whether a woman alone on a homestead was seen as a temporary situation by everyone around her, including people who meant well. "It is the assumption that bothers me most," she said, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "That this is not my permanent situation, that I am waiting for something to resolve it into something else, as though I am not already resolved. You are the most resolved person I have met in a considerable number of counties," he said, and it was said with such dry sincerity that she laughed, and the sound of her own laugh in the kitchen felt like something coming back to life that had been dormant. He helped her with the dishes, which she had not asked him to do, and which he did with the same natural ease with which he seemed to do everything. And when they were done and she had put the lamp on the table and the kitchen was warm and the night was outside the windows with its particular prairie depth, she looked at him and thought, "This is the beginning of something." She was not afraid of it. She was thoughtful about it, in the way she was thoughtful about everything, but she was not afraid. He came back the following Sunday and the Sunday after that, and on the third Sunday he brought her something he had found at the dry goods store in Harlan's, crossing a small seed catalog from a company out of St. Louis, the kind that had drawings of vegetables and flowers in it. It was a small thing, trivial in one sense, and in another sense it was exactly right, because he had noticed that she had a kitchen garden that her father had started and that she was trying to expand it, and the catalog had varieties in it she had not been able to find in the territory. She took it from him at the door with an expression she did not try to fully conceal. "You remembered me mentioning the garden. You mentioned it twice," he said. "The second time you seemed frustrated about the seed situation." She held the catalog against her chest for a moment. "Come in," she said. May arrived, and with it news from the county seat that was better than she had expected. Cole Aldrich had, through his lawyers, filed an inquiry about the survey of the Parson land, but the county recorder had responded with the full documentation of the Keene filing and the surveyor's original marks, and the inquiry had been returned with a notation that no basis for dispute was currently established. It was not a permanent resolution. Cole Aldrich was not the kind of man to be put off by a single administrative answer, but it was ground held, and in this kind of situation, ground held was everything. She told Daniel about it on a Tuesday evening when he came by, ostensibly to check on a section of fence near the barn that he wanted to make sure had seeded properly after the last rain. He had been doing this, finding small, legitimate reasons to be at the property, and she had been letting him, which was its own kind of conversation. "That is good news," he said, standing on the porch with her in the mild spring evening. "It is," she said. "I wanted to thank you for telling me about the survey situation when you did. It gave me the time to get the documentation in order before anything could be formally disputed." "You would have figured it out yourself," he said. "Probably," she said, "but later and with less margin." He was quiet, looking out at the fence line, which in the early evening light looked solid and permanent and right. "How is the south pasture holding?" he asked. "Better than it has since last summer," she said. "The cattle cannot drift and the grass is coming in well. I am thinking about adding stock in the fall if the summer holds." She looked at him sideways. "I know you will have other work to move to." He turned to look at her. "I am in no hurry," he said. There was a warmth in her chest that she recognized as something she should not try to contain. "No," she said. "No," he said. She turned to face him more fully. The evening light was making everything the color of honey, the grass and the fence posts and the pale wood of the porch boards, and she thought she had never been so entirely and unremarkably in the right place. "I need to ask you something practical," she said. "All right. What do you intend?" She said it plainly, without the careful hedging she sometimes used when she was not sure of the ground. "I do not mean as a criticism or a demand. I mean that I am a practical woman and I find it useful to understand the shape of things." He was quiet for a moment and she waited, and this time the waiting was comfortable rather than tense. "I intend," he said slowly, "to be wherever is useful to be. I have no particular destination. I have been moving for years and I am not sure that was ever because I wanted to move as much as it was because I did not have a reason to stop." She looked at him. "Is that changing?" "Yes," he said. Simply, without elaboration, the way he said true things. She nodded. "I thought it might be," she said, and went back inside. But she left the door open behind her, which she had not done before, and he came in and sat at the kitchen table, and they spent the evening talking about the fall stock plans and the railroad and the best variety of winter squash for the Kansas soil. And it was entirely ordinary and entirely wonderful. The summer was long and hot and relentless in the way that Kansas summers always were. The sun hammering down on the flat land with a democratic ferocity, the grass going brown and then burnt-looking, the creek dropping to a slow green trickle. Caroline worked the land with the focused determination she applied to everything, getting up before the heat and working until it was too much and then working again in the evening when it softened. The cattle were fine. The fence held. The kitchen garden, with its new varieties from the catalog, produced with a gratifying abundance. Daniel had begun doing other work on the property. She had not asked him, and he had not asked her permission, but there was an understanding between them now that had settled into something comfortable and mutual. He saw things that needed doing and did them, and she saw this and appreciated it. And occasionally she would come outside to find that the barn roof had a new board in the gap she had been meaning to get to, or that the broken spoke of the wagon wheel had been replaced with a new one, or that the stone wall around the kitchen garden had been reset where it had started to lean. One afternoon in July, she came out to find him rehanging the gate that had been broken since before her father died. She had put it on the list of things to fix, but it had never risen high enough on the list, and now it was fixed, hung level and solid on new hardware, opening and closing with a smooth ease that felt almost luxurious after years of lifting and forcing. She stood and watched him test the latch. He had not seen her yet. He opened the gate and closed it, opened it again. There was something in the attention he gave to this small action, the testing and the careful checking, that reached somewhere inside her and found the part of her that had been most alone since her father died, the part that noticed when things were broken and felt the weight of being the only one who would fix them. "Daniel," she said. He turned. "Come here," she said. He came, crossing the yard in a few easy strides, and when he reached her she looked up at him. He was taller than her by about half a foot, which she had registered every time they stood near each other, and she said, "I want to say something to you." "Say it," he said. "I have been thinking about the fence," she said, "about why you built it, about what you said, that the simple answer was not available to you." He waited. "I understand it now," she said. "I did not entirely at first, but I have had time to think and I understand it. You could not say you built it for me because that would have been too much to say to someone who did not know you, but you could not say you built it for practical reasons only because that would not have been the truth. So you built it and you let the building be the answer, and you trusted that eventually I would understand the answer." She looked at him. "Was that right?" He was looking at her with an expression that was very quiet and very concentrated. "More or less right," he said. "The fence is a very good fence," she said. "I wanted it to be." She reached out and put her hand on his forearm, where his shirt was rolled up, and she could feel the warmth of his skin and the solidity of the muscle beneath. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He put his hand over hers, and for a moment they stood there in the hot July afternoon with the cottonwoods making their rain sound in the dry wind and the cattle moving slow and patient in the south pasture, and it was a moment that Caroline knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Then he said, with a carefulness that she recognized as the thing she trusted most in him, "Caroline, yes, I would very much like to court you properly," he said, "if you would allow it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You have been courting me," she said, "since you first drove that post into the ground." The smile was full and unhesitating, and she felt it like sun on her face. "Then I would like to be more straightforward about it," he said. "I think that would be an improvement," she said. He raised an eyebrow in that way he had, slightly dry. "For both of us. Particularly for me," she said. She did not remove her hand from his arm for a long moment. When she finally did, it was to walk back toward the house, and this time she looked back. The proper courtship, as Daniel had called it, involved a sequence of things that were both ordinary and, in their particular context, significant. He took her to the July 4th celebration in Harlan's Crossing, where the town put up bunting, and the widow Hartman made her celebrated lemon cake, and the men competed at various tests of skill that were mostly just excuses to show off. Daniel had no interest in showing off, which she had predicted, and they stood at the edge of the gathering and watched and talked quietly, which was far more enjoyable than the showing off. Eliza Murdoch came to find them at one point, with an expression of barely contained delight that she was not even trying to contain. "Miss Keene," she said, looking at Daniel with bright expectancy. "Eliza, you know Daniel Sawyer," Caroline said. "Of course I do," Eliza said. "Fine work on that fence of yours, Mr. Sawyer. I drove past it last week. That is a fence that knows what it is doing." "Thank you," Daniel said in his way, which was to accept compliments without expanding on them. "My Henry built our fence in 1869, Eliza said. "It fell down in 1870. She looked at Daniel. "You are welcome to come look at it." Caroline did not quite laugh. Daniel kept a perfectly straight face. "I will keep that in mind," he said. After Eliza moved on, Caroline said quietly, "She has been waiting for this moment since February." "She knew," he said. "Eliza Murdoch has known everything that was going to happen in this county before it happened for the last 15 years, Caroline said. "She told me you had a good reputation 3 days after I first saw you building." He seemed to find this both amusing and humbling. "What did you do with that information?" "I kept bringing you water," she said. "Cole Aldridge made one more attempt in August, and this one was more direct. His foreman, a taciturn man named Briggs, came to the property with 2 of the ranch hands and a document that purported to show a resurvey of the Parson claim. The document was dated 3 weeks prior and had the signature of a surveyor that Caroline did not recognize. She stood on the porch with the document in her hand and read it through twice, and she was careful to keep her face neutral while she did so. "I will need to verify this with the county land office," she said. "Mr. Aldridge would appreciate a prompt resolution," Briggs said. He was not threatening her directly, but the 2 ranch hands behind him were providing an argument by presence. "Mr. Aldridge will receive as prompt a response as the county land office is able to provide," she said. After they left, she went to find Daniel, who was in the barn working on the harness. She showed him the document, and he read it and then read it again more slowly, and when he looked up his expression was very steady. "This surveyor's name," he said. "Harlan Cates. I have heard that name before." "Where?" "In Dodge City 3 years ago. He was connected to a land fraud operation that cost 3 families their claims before the operation was shut down. He set the document on the bench. He works for whoever is paying him most." Caroline sat down on the bench across from him. "Then it is a false survey." "Almost certainly. But proving it is false requires getting the county surveyor out here to do a proper resurvey, and that takes time, and Aldridge knows that the more confusion he can create in the official record, the harder it is for you to hold a clean position. She thought about this. What would you do? He looked at her. I would go to the land office in Ellsworth immediately, file a formal protest of the survey, and request an official county resurvey. And I would get the name of that attorney Schofield you spoke to before and put him on notice. She was already standing. How long would the drive take? You could be there by tomorrow afternoon if you left early. Come with me, she said. He was quiet for just a moment. If you want me there, he said. I want you there, she said directly. They left before dawn the next morning, Caroline driving and Daniel beside her on the wagon seat, the stars still sharp above the flat land and the air carrying the particular coolness that comes to the prairie in the last hour before sunrise. They talked through the situation methodically, working through the options and the likely responses. And then, when everything practical had been said, they simply drove in a companionable quiet that felt natural to both of them. She was aware of him beside her in a way that was no longer uncertain. She knew the shape of him now, the way he thought, the careful steadiness of him, the dry humor that emerged in small flashes, the fact that when he said he would do something, he did it. She had been taking the measure of people for her entire life, with the accuracy that comes from growing up in a place where you needed to know who to trust, and she trusted Daniel Sawyer in the way she trusted the cottonwoods and the creek and the land itself, not blindly, because she was not a blind woman but completely. Can I ask you something? She said somewhere around the second hour of the drive when the sky had turned from dark blue to the pale gray of coming dawn. Yes, he said. When you were deciding whether to come here, she said. When you were in this county for those 2 months, learning the shape of things, was there a moment when you decided to build the fence, or was it a gradual thing? He thought about it. There was a morning, he said. Early March. I rode past the property from the road and I could see the fence line from there, or what was left of it. And I could see the house, and the smoke from the chimney and the cattle in the south pasture. And I thought, he paused. I thought that this was a place that deserved to remain, that it had the particular quality of something built by people who intended it to last, and that it would be a waste for it to be lost. She turned to look at him. The horizon was beginning to show the first thin line of orange. And then, she said, and then I went back to the rooming house and thought about whether it was any of my business, he said, and concluded that it could be made to be my business if I applied the right effort. She laughed softly. The right effort being 3 months of fence building. I did not know it would be 3 months at the start, he said. I thought perhaps 6 weeks. The fence is longer than it looks from the road, she said. It is, he agreed. The orange line on the horizon was widening, the sky above it going the particular shade of rose that happens just before the sun breaks through, and the flat land was turning from gray to gold around them. And Caroline Keene was on a wagon seat next to a man who had driven fence posts into her ground for 3 months as a way of saying something he could not find simple words for, and she thought that there were many worse ways to have a thing said to you. Daniel, she said. Yes. I am going to say something to you that I have not said to anyone since my father died, which is that I am glad you came. He was very still for a moment. So am I, he said. And then, after a beat, with the slight softness that she had come to look for, more than I can find simple words for. She looked at him and he looked at her, and then they both looked back at the road, and the sun came up. The land office in Ellsworth was competent and on the side of documented fact, which was all Caroline needed it to be. She filed the formal protest of the Aldridge survey with a copy of the original Keene survey documentation, a written statement from Mr. Schofield attesting to the validity of the original filing, and a request for an official county resurvey to be conducted within 30 days. The county recorder, a thin, careful man named Wilson, looked over the documents with the focused attention of someone who had seen a great deal of land fraud in his career and found it wearisome. The signature on the Aldridge survey, Daniel said, setting down the information he had written out on a sheet of paper he had prepared the night before, while Caroline slept in the rooming house and he sat at the desk in his own room. Harlan Cates. He is known in Dodge City and Caldwell for producing surveys for hire. Wilson looked at the paper and his thin face became thinner. "I know that name," he said. "I thought you might," Daniel said. The resurvey was scheduled for 3 weeks hence, and Mr. Schofield was given a formal letter from the county confirming the protest and the pending survey. It was not over, but the legal ground was now as solid as it could be made. On the drive home, Caroline said, "You prepared that information about Harlan Cates last night." "I wanted to be useful," he said. She looked at him. "You are very useful," she said. "That is not the thing I value most about you, but it is notable." He turned to look at her. "What do you value most?" She considered it honestly. "That you tell me the truth," she said. "That when I ask you something, you try to actually answer it. Even when the answer is complicated." She looked forward at the road. "Most people, when they cannot answer simply, give you the simple answer anyway and let you fill in the rest wrong. You say you cannot answer simply, and you let me know the complicated one is there." He was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that the most discourteous thing you can do to a person is to give them an answer you know to be incomplete." "Your father was right," she said. "He was right about a number of things," Daniel said, "and wrong about a number of others. The right one stayed with me." The county surveyor came out on a Thursday in the 3rd week of August, and the survey took 2 full days because the surveyor, a thorough man named Peterson, who seemed personally offended by the idea that someone had submitted a fraudulent survey in his county, was not going to do a partial job of it. He reran the original survey lines using the original markers and measurements, and the results were precisely what the original survey had shown. The Aldridge claim to the Parson land ended at the line where it had always ended, not a foot further. Cole Aldridge, through his lawyers, made one more filing, disputing the surveyor's methodology, and this one was dismissed within a week. And that, as far as the official record was concerned, was that. Caroline received the notice from the county land office on a Saturday morning, and she sat on the porch with it for a long time before she trusted herself to read it through again. Then she walked to the kitchen and cooked a proper breakfast, which she rarely did on a regular morning, because she needed something to do with her hands. Daniel came by in the afternoon. She had not told him to come. He came because it was Saturday and he had taken to coming on Saturdays now. She met him at the gate that he had fixed in July that swung open so cleanly, and she held up the letter. He read it. He looked up. The expression on his face was the one she knew best by now, the quiet, concentrated steadiness, with something warm underneath it. "It is over," she said. "It is," he said. "My land is secure." "Yes." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and looked at him in the August afternoon light, which was still very hot but had a particular golden quality that late summer brings to the Kansas plain, as if the heat were being converted to light before it faded. The cottonwoods behind the barn were moving in a slow wind. "Come have supper with me," she said. "I would like that very much," he said. She cooked everything. She had been saving the good cut of beef she had been waiting for a proper occasion, the last of the summer squash from the garden and the new variety from the catalog, the berry preserves she had put up in June. She set the table properly with the cloth her mother had embroidered, which she had only used twice since her mother died when Caroline was 17. She lit 2 candles. When Daniel came to the table and saw the embroidered cloth and the candles, he was quiet for a moment. "This is a proper meal," he said. "You have been eating from the cooking of a woman too tired to cook properly since April," she said. "That is long enough." They ate slowly and talked about everything: the fall plans, the stock she was considering, the railroad and what the land purchase would mean for the county, the winter preparations that would need to begin in October. And they talked about things that had nothing to do with the land: his time in Missouri, her mother, the books they had each read and found worth keeping, the particular quality of a prairie night that had no equivalent anywhere else. After supper, While they were doing the dishes, he said, "I need to tell you something." She dried her hands on the towel and turned to look at him. He was leaning against the counter with the careful expression that meant he had been thinking about this for some time. "Tell me," she said. "I have been offered work," he said, "in Dodge City. 3 months of fence and property work for a cattle operation. Good pay." He looked at her steadily. "I have been considering whether to take it." She waited. "The reason I have been considering it," he said, "is that I cannot take it and also be here, and I find that I strongly prefer being here." She understood the shape of what he was saying. She looked at him and let herself feel the full weight of it without the guard she had been keeping up, not because the guard was wrong but because it was no longer necessary. "I do not want you to go to Dodge City," she said. He exhaled slowly. "That is useful to know." "What I mean," she said more precisely, "is that I do not want you to go anywhere. I want you to stay here." She looked at him with the directness that was her particular way of saying the true thing. "I have been alone on this land for over a year, and it was the right way to be, and I did it well, and I would do it again if I had to. But I do not want to do it again. I want you here." She paused. "I want to see what we would be, properly and fully. I want to know the rest of the conversation." He was very still for a moment. "I am asking you to stay," she said. "Not as a hired man, not as someone who builds fences without being asked. As something else, something that I think we have both known has been building since April." She looked at the floor for just a moment and then back up at him, because she was not someone who looked away from the things she meant. "I am not asking you to make any sudden decisions. I am asking you to decide that this is where the moving stops." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands in both of his, and she felt the warmth of them, the solidity, the broad scarred knuckles that she had been noticing since the first morning she brought him water. "I have known since March that the moving was going to stop here," he said, "if you would have me. I have been waiting to know if you would." "I will," she said, and then with the smallest smile, "I do not make that kind of statement lightly." "I know you do not," he said. He raised her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to them with a formality that was entirely genuine, and she thought she would remember this kitchen, this light, this moment, for the rest of her long life. The proposal came on a Sunday in late September, which was the right time for it in the way that some things are simply right. The summer heat had finally broken, and the mornings were cool and sharp, the sky that particular deep blue of a Kansas autumn, and the cottonwoods were beginning to turn. Caroline had been in the kitchen garden, cutting the last of the fall squash, when Daniel came to find her. He had been working on a project in the barn for several days that he had not explained, coming and going with the kind of focused concentration he applied to things that required precision. She had not asked about it. She was learning the particular pleasure of waiting for Daniel Sawyer to be ready to show you something. He stood at the garden gate, that good gate, swinging clean on its properly hung hardware, and he had his hat in his hands, and his expression was the particular one she had come to know as the one that meant he had arrived at something after a long time of thinking. She set down the squash she was holding. He came into the garden and took something from his shirt pocket. It was a small circle of silver wire, braided with a neatness that spoke of considerable practice, with a small piece of turquoise set in it that glowed the color of the sky above them. He held it out to her. "I made that," he said. "I know it is not the kind of thing that a proper jeweler would make, but I wanted something I had made myself so that it would mean what I meant it to mean." She looked at it. The braid was exact and even, the turquoise set cleanly. It was beautiful in the way that things made with intention rather than ease are beautiful. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to stay on this land with you and work it with you and build whatever life you have in mind here. I am not asking you to give up anything. I am asking to be part of what you are already doing." He looked at her steadily. "If you will have me." She took the ring from his hand and held it. "I will have you," she said, "entirely." He slid the ring onto her finger and she let him take her hand after he did, and they stood in the kitchen garden with the autumn sun on them and the squash at their feet and the fence. That beautiful, presumptuous, honest fence visible in the distance running the length of her boundary, and she thought, "This is my life, and it is very full." She kissed him then, standing up on her toes in the garden, and it was the first time they had kissed, and it was everything she would have wanted it to be, warm and certain and unhurried, like something that had been heading toward this moment since a morning in April when she looked out from her porch and saw a man driving posts into the ground. They were married in October, in the small Methodist church in Harlan's Crossing, on a day that was cold and clear and so blue it looked like a painting of itself. Eliza Murdoch cried at a volume that was not really appropriate for a church, but that nobody begrudged her because she had, in her own way, been invested in this outcome for months. The minister was a young man named Holt who had come to the territory 6 months ago and had not yet lost his optimism about it, which Caroline appreciated. He spoke about building things, which she thought was either a remarkable coincidence or a kind of knowing. The town turned out in the way that small towns turn out for weddings when they like both parties and have been waiting for the occasion, which was comprehensively. There were 3 fiddle players and a man with a mouth harp, and the dancing in the church hall afterward was the kind that goes until midnight and then past it, fueled by goodwill and by the particular apple cider that Samuel Pryor made in the fall from his orchard north of town. Caroline danced with Daniel and also with the minister, and also with 3 different farmers who were all considerably older than her, and who danced with a kind of earnest enthusiasm that she found genuinely touching. Daniel danced with her and also with Eliza Murdoch, and also with a small girl of about 7 who had come with her family, and who had asked him with great seriousness if he knew how to waltz. He did. Late in the evening, when the music was slower and the crowd had thinned to the dedicated celebrants, they danced together in a corner of the floor, and she had her head against his shoulder and he had his arms around her, and it was both the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing she had ever felt. "Eliza Murdoch told me at some point in the evening," he said against her hair, "that she knew this was going to happen in February." "I know she did," Caroline said. "She said the same thing to me in May." "What did she say in February?" "She said that you had the look of a man who was about to do something that was going to take longer than he thought." She felt him laugh, which was a good sensation, his chest moving with it. "She was not wrong," he said. "She rarely is," Caroline said. "It is one of her most irritating qualities." The winter was the first winter in over a year that Caroline did not spend alone, and the difference was something she had not fully calculated in advance. It was not that she could not have managed the winter alone. She had managed the previous one and managed it capably. It was that managing something alone takes a constant expenditure of self that you do not fully notice until you are no longer spending it. And what you find when you stop spending it is a kind of warmth that has been missing from the account. They spent the winter evenings by the lamp, she reading and he writing in his journal or working on some piece of repair that was more easily done by lamplight than the winter cold of the barn. They talked about the land plans for spring, about the cattle, about what varieties of corn she wanted to try in the kitchen garden. He read to her sometimes from the newspaper that came from Ellsworth, and she listened with the particular pleasure of someone who was busy when she was alone, and now had the luxury of listening instead of doing everything. She learned his habits, that he was awake before her always, and that the coffee was made before she came downstairs, that he kept a list in the back of his journal of things that needed doing on the property, updated every Sunday, that he was not talkative in the mornings and entirely willing to be talked to in the evenings, that he slept on the right side of the bed with one arm over her in a way that was both unintentional and permanent. She told him things she had not told anyone, about her mother, who had died when Caroline was 17 from a fever that came too fast to fight, and who had been a woman of considerable wit and warmth, about the year after her mother died, which was hard in a way that was different from the hardness of other things, about the fact that she had been offered a position as a teacher in a town in Illinois when she was 21, and had considered it genuinely before deciding that she could not leave the land. About why she could not leave the land. He listened to all of it with the quality of attention that she had first noticed from across a fence line, completely present, without the slight distraction or impatience that most people showed when the subject was someone else's inner life. "Do you regret it?" he asked, about the teaching position. "Not going?" "No," she said. "I would have been good at it, but I was not ready to be away from here." And now she looked around the kitchen, warm and lamplit, and out the window at the dark prairie with the stars above it. "Now I cannot imagine having been anywhere else." "Good," he said quietly. "Were you ever sorry," she said, "that you came here?" He looked at her with a steady, clear directness that she loved. "Not for 1 hour," he said. "Spring came early in 1879, the creek running high in February, the ground soft before March. Caroline planned an expanded kitchen garden and the addition of a dozen more head of cattle to the south pasture, and Daniel drew up the plans for a second barn structure that would handle the expanded herd and protect the feed stock through the winters more efficiently. They worked together in the way that two people work together when they have learned each other well enough to know who does what better, and neither one is bothered by the question. The railroad purchase offer came in April. It was a letter from the Kansas Pacific Railroad Company, addressed to the Keene property, offering to purchase a right-of-way corridor through the southern edge of the property at a price that was reasonable without being overly generous. The letter made it clear that this was a standard purchase offer and that negotiation was possible. Caroline sat with the letter for an evening and then brought it to the kitchen table where Daniel was working on his list. "What do you think?" she asked. He read it carefully. "The southern edge is not the best pasture land," he said. "The corridor they are describing would take about 12 acres. What they are offering is fair per acre, but you could argue for more given the strategic position of the property along the route." I thought the same. He put the letter down and looked at her. "What do you want to do?" "I want to sell the corridor at a better price, use the funds to complete the second barn and add the stock I have been planning, and see whether the railroad's presence changes the value of the property enough to consider other improvements in the next few years." She looked at him. "That is what I want. What do you think of it?" "I think it is the right plan," he said. "I also think you should write back and ask for 20% more per acre than they offered and see where they land." She smiled. "That was exactly what I was going to suggest." "I know," he said. "I have been watching you negotiate." The railroad negotiation concluded in May with a price 15% higher than the original offer, which was near enough to what they had wanted to be satisfying. The funds came in the summer, and the second barn went up in August and September with the help of 3 neighbors and a professional carpenter from Harlan's Crossing. And when it was done, it was solid and large, and gave the operation a permanent quality that it had lacked when it was a single woman doing everything possible to hold on. Cole Aldridge, Caroline learned through Eliza Murdoch in the late summer of 1879, had finally overreached himself. 2 of the homesteaders he had driven off their claims in the previous years had found a lawyer in Topeka who specialized in land fraud, and the combination of the fraudulent survey in the Harlan Cates case and the pattern of complaints across the county had been sufficient to bring a formal legal action. The case had been drawn out and expensive, and Cole had ultimately agreed to a settlement that included restitution to the affected families and a restriction on his ability to file land claims in the county for 5 years. It was not a hanging, but it was a consequence, and in this territory at this time, a consequence was not nothing. Caroline heard this news and felt a complex satisfaction that was not entirely triumph and not entirely regret. The men and women who had lost their land had not gotten it back. The settlement helped them, but it did not restore what had been taken, and she knew that better than most. But the pattern had been named and addressed, and the people who had suffered it had been seen, which was what justice could sometimes manage when it could not manage everything. She told Daniel about it that evening. "The Parson family," he said, thinking about the original Parson claim, the one that had been used as a pretext. "What happened to them?" "They had moved to Colorado," she said. They received restitution, but they did not come back. He was quiet for a moment. She knew what he was thinking because she had been thinking it too, that the land did not always stay with the people who should have had it, that the history of this territory was full of claims and losses and displacements that extended much further and much deeper than the Aldridge situation, that the larger injustices of who owned what ground and what had been done to acquire it ran underneath everything like the groundwater that fed the creek. She thought about it without pretending it was simple, which was the only honest way to think about it. "We hold what we have," she said, "and we are honest about how it was gotten and what it means." He nodded. "Yes," he said, "that is all anyone can do, and not everyone manages even that." The fall of 1879 brought in the best harvest the kitchen garden had ever produced, and the cattle herd was 22 head and all in good condition, and the second barn held the winter feed dry and secure. Caroline walked the south pasture in October and felt the land under her boots the way she always felt it, like something that was hers in the most fundamental sense, not because she had purchased it, though she had, through inheritance and through labor, but because it was part of what she was made of, and she was part of what it was made of. Daniel was at the fence line. He went there sometimes in the evening, not to work on it but just to walk it, the way you walk the edge of something you made to check that it is still itself. She had started coming with him. The fence looked exactly as it should. 3 months of work and over a year later, and it was as solid and true as it had been the day he finished it. The post stood straight in the Kansas ground, the wire taut between them with the tension that meant it would hold without snapping, and the whole length of it ran from the road to the barn corner in a clean line that said, "This is the place. This is where things are kept." She took his hand as they walked, which she had been doing for months now, and which was one of the ordinary daily pleasures of her life. "Do you remember what you said to me," she said, "when I first asked you why you were building this?" He glanced at her. "I said I could not give you a simple answer." "You could now," she said. "If you wanted to, you know the whole answer now." He thought about it as they walked. The evening was cool and blue, the stars beginning to show, the cottonwoods making their rain sound. "I built it," he said, "because I saw a place that deserved to stand and a person who deserved to hold it, and I had the skills to make one of those things more likely, and I had the hope, which was not something I was entitled to but which I had anyway, that in making myself useful I might also find a way to make myself known." He looked at her. "That is the honest version. The simple version is that I came here for you, even when I was pretending to myself that I had come for the fence line." She squeezed his hand. "That is a good simple version," she said. "You should have led with that." "I did not know you then," he said. "You were terrifying." She laughed fully and freely out there in the evening with the stars coming out above the flat land. "I was not terrifying." "You were very terrifying," he said, and his eyes were warm and lit with amusement. "You came down with your coffee cup, and you looked at those 6 posts, and then you looked at me, and I was absolutely certain I had made a catastrophic error in judgment. But you kept going," she said. "The posts were already in the ground," he said. She stopped walking and turned to face him there on the fence line in the October dark. "Daniel." "Yes. I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her, and something in her tone changed the quality of his attention from casual to very present. "Tell me," he said. She took a breath. "We are going to have a child," she said. The silence lasted for exactly the length of time it takes a man to understand something very large. Then he took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was so complete it almost undid her. "When?" he said. "April," she said. "Near enough." He put his forehead against hers, and she could feel him breathing, and she thought she had never stood anywhere more fully in her life than she was standing in this moment, on this ground with this man, with the fence they had built together, him with his hands and her with her trust visible along the boundary in the evening light. "April," he said again. "Yes." He kissed her there at the fence line in the fall dark, with the prairie around them and the stars above them and the land solid under their feet. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold in the way that Kansas winters can be cold. with the wind coming straight down from the north, without anything to stop it, and the ground going hard as iron by December. They spent it in the house together, warm and well-provisioned, and Caroline's pregnancy progressed with the same practical stubbornness she applied to everything, which is to say, she did not make a great fuss over it and continued to do what needed doing until doing it became genuinely impractical. Daniel was attentive in a way that she would not have predicted from a man of few words, quietly watchful, present in the particular way that meant he was always near but never hovering, responsive without being anxious. He took on the heavier work without being asked, and without making a point of having done so, which was exactly right. He read to her in the evenings more often than before, from the newspapers and from the 2 books of poetry she kept on the kitchen shelf, and she fell asleep to his voice sometimes and woke to find the lamp turned low and a blanket over her. She told him once in the depth of winter, "You are very good at this." He looked up from the newspaper. "At what?" "At being here," she said, "at being present without being oppressive about it." He considered this. "I had good practice," he said, "building fences. Being somewhere without being asked for," he said, with the dry undercurrent that meant he was slightly amused at himself. She smiled. "You were always asked for," she said. "You just did not know it yet." The child was born on a morning in early April when the first green was showing in the grass, and the meadowlarks had been back for a week, which Caroline took as a good omen. The labor was managed with the assistance of Mrs. Pryor, the wife of the apple orchard farmer, who had delivered more than a dozen babies in the county, and who had the particular calm of someone who has done something so many times that they have stopped seeing it as extraordinary and started seeing it as what it is, which is necessary and important. The child was a boy. He was large and loud and apparently healthy, and he looked at the world with an expression of considerable outrage at having been brought into it that made Mrs. Pryor laugh, and that made Daniel go very still in the way he went still when something was very large. "He is beautiful," Daniel said, which was not entirely accurate in the way that newborns are not entirely accurate, but was true in the way that mattered. "He is very loud," Caroline said, still exhausted and more completely happy than she had been since she could remember. They named him Thomas for her father, Thomas James Sawyer. He was 3 weeks old before he had any interest in doing anything but eating and sleeping and expressing opinions about the arrangement. And then gradually, he became something more like a person, which was a process that Caroline watched with the same quality of attention she gave to things she was still learning about. Daniel held his son in the evenings after supper with a sureness that surprised her, and then did not surprise her because Daniel was sure at everything he did that mattered. He would walk the kitchen with Thomas in the last of the evening, talking to him in the low, quiet voice he used with animals and with people who needed settling, and Thomas would go still in a way he did not go still for anyone else, and Caroline would watch from the table and feel the particular fullness of a life that has become what it was always trying to be. The spring of 1880 was good. The cattle herd grew. The kitchen garden was planted with the full range of the catalog varieties +2 that she had got seeds for through Eliza Murdoch, from a woman who had come from Ohio, with a family of heirloom squash varieties that did remarkably well in Kansas soil. The railroad right-of-way through the southern pasture remained quiet and unobtrusive, just a cleared corridor that occasionally had survey crews along it, and that had not yet been built on, which was typical of railroad planning, which moved at its own particular pace, unconnected to anything so urgent as the present year. One afternoon in May, Daniel was working on a new section of the pasture fence, not the original boundary fence, which still stood perfectly, but an interior division fence he was putting in to better manage the grazing rotation. Caroline came out with his afternoon water, as she had done every working day since April of 1878, and sat on the post stack as she had done then, and handed him the jar. He drank it and handed it back, and she sat looking at the fence he was building. Do you know what day it is? She said. He thought about it. Tuesday. It is Tuesday the 14th, she said. 2 years ago, roughly this week, was when I first saw you building. He lowered the post driver and looked at the fence line, the original boundary fence, visible from here, running clean and solid along the southern edge of the property. 2 years, he said. And 3 months of fence building, she said. He looked at her. She was 26 now, with the particular quality that hard work and genuine contentment together give a person, which is both more weathered and more fully alive than either alone. She had Thomas on her hip, which she had been managing with the same capable ease she managed everything else, and the May light was on her face, and the meadowlarks were somewhere in the tall new grass, and Daniel Sawyer looked at his wife and his son and his fence and his land, and thought that he had spent a long time moving towards something without knowing what the something was, and that it had been this. Exactly this. I did not know, he said, when I drove the first post that I was building anything other than a fence. I know, she said. I know that you know, he said. I am saying it because I want to say it out loud in the light as a true thing. She looked at him. And now? She said, and now I know that I was building everything, he said. The fence was just where it started. She stood from the post stack and came to him. Thomas settled on her hip and looking around at the world with the expression of interested assessment that was already his signature expression, and she put her free hand against Daniel's face and he covered it with his own. Everything, she said. Yes. Thomas reached out and grabbed a fistful of Daniel's shirt, which was what he did when he was interested in something, which was his way of saying, I am here too and you should know it. Yes, Daniel said to his son, you are included in everything. The meadowlarks called from the tall grass and the fence line ran its solid length along the south boundary, and the cottonwoods behind the barn made their rain sound in the warm spring wind, and the Keene land, which was also the Sawyer land now, both of them true, the names sitting side by side on the deed as they sat side by side in the kitchen and in the field and in the long, quiet evenings, spread out around them in every direction, green and full and entirely, permanently, irreducibly theirs. She kissed him then, with Thomas between them making a sound of mild protest at being squeezed, and they both laughed, and the laugh carried out over the open land, the way sound carries over flat ground in the spring, further than you expect, further than seems possible, touching everything it reaches with the particular warmth of something alive and certain and unashamed. There was a second winter after Thomas, and a third spring, and the land continued to do what land does when tended well and loved with the particular combination of practicality and devotion that Caroline had always brought to it, and that Daniel brought to everything he cared about. The herd grew to 35 head. The kitchen garden was expanded with a cold frame that Daniel built in the fall so that the growing season extended 6 weeks longer on either end. The original boundary fence remained exactly as it was, needing only minor maintenance in the third year where a single post had heaved in the frost, and that Daniel fixed in an afternoon. Thomas grew into a boy who was, by the age of 2, deeply interested in everything, particularly in his father's work, and who could often be found sitting on the fence rail of the south pasture, watching the cattle with an expression of thoughtful assessment that made his mother laugh every time she saw it. On the morning of Caroline's 28th birthday, in October of 1881, Daniel came in from the early chores with the coffee made, and a small package on the kitchen table wrapped in brown paper. She opened it at the table with Thomas climbing on her lap and found inside a small watercolor painting of the fence line, rendered carefully and accurately, with the land and sky around it in the particular gold and blue of a late spring afternoon, and 2 small figures at the near post, a man and a woman standing close enough to be clearly together. Where did this come from? She said. I made it, he said. She looked at him. I did not know you painted. I did not either, he said, until I had something I wanted to paint. She looked at the painting for a long time. It was not a professional painting. The figures were a bit stiff, and the perspective was slightly off in a way that was somehow charming rather than wrong. But the fence was perfect, every post in the right position, the wire true between them, the whole length of it running with the precision she knew from having walked it 100 times. He had gotten the fence exactly right, and the land around it and the sky above it, and the two small figures standing in the late spring light with everything they had built between them and ahead of them and all around them. She set the painting on the shelf where she could see it from the kitchen table. "The fence started all of it," she said. "Yes," he said, "I am very glad you built it." "So am I," he said, "more than I ever thought I would be glad of anything." Thomas reached up and patted his mother's face, which was his way of asking for attention, and she turned to him and held him against her and looked at her husband over her son's head with the full, certain warmth of a woman who has her life in the shape she always needed it to be in, and who knows it, which is rarer than it should be and more wonderful for that rarity. Outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwoods in that sound that her father had said was like rain, and the fence stood along the south boundary in the morning light, solid and straight and enduring, the way things endure when they are built with care by someone who already knew, even when he could not say so simply, that he was building toward love.